Off the coast of Israel, about a kilometer from shore, the seafloor holds something that has no business being there. A village. Not the ruins of a shipwreck, not scattered pottery dropped overboard by ancient traders. An actual village, houses with walls still standing, wells that people dug by hand, a circle of standing stones arranged with obvious intention, burials, bones, seeds, the physical leftovers of real daily life, and all of it sitting under roughly 10 meters of Mediterranean seawater where it has been sitting, largely undisturbed for thousands of years. This is Atlit Yam, and it is one of the most remarkable things ever found on this planet. The site lies just off the Carmel coast in northern Israel, near the ancient town of Atlit, a stretch of shoreline that has been inhabited in one form or another for an almost incomprehensible length of time. The eastern Mediterranean here is calm and relatively shallow, close to the coast, which is part of why divers were able to find the site at all, and part of why what they found was preserved so well. Roughly 9,000 years ago, the people of Atlit Yam were not living underwater. They were living on land, dry, solid, ordinary land. They were building homes, drawing water from wells, burying their dead beneath their floors, raising animals, tending crops, and doing all the quiet, unremarkable things that communities do when they expect to be somewhere for a long time. Then at some point they were gone, and the sea moved in. What archaeologists have pulled from this site, carefully documented and studied since its discovery in the 1980s, reads like an inventory of a life interrupted. There are rectangular stone structures that were clearly houses, with enough of their walls preserved to tell you something about how people arranged their living space. There are 7 freshwater wells, which is a remarkable number for a settlement this size, and tells you something important about how seriously these people manage their water supply. There is a semicircle of standing stones surrounding what appears to have been a freshwater spring, and that arrangement is deliberate enough that it raises immediate questions about meaning and ceremony. There are human skeletons, some showing signs of disease that had never been identified in populations this old before their discovery here. There are animal bones, fish bones, grain seeds, the whole picture of a functioning Neolithic community, frozen in archaeological time and then sealed under the sea. The question that drives everything about Atlit Yam is deceptively simple. What happened? Did something sudden and catastrophic force the people out? Or did the sea rise so slowly that the abandonment was gradual, a community walking away from land that was becoming less and less livable over generations? Was it a single event, a wave or a flood that arrived without warning? Or was it the slow, patient work of rising water that eventually swallowed everything they had built? The evidence points in more than one direction, and that tension is part of what makes this site so fascinating and so unresolved. We know what was left behind. We don't know, not with certainty, why it was left behind at all. There is something specific and strange about standing knowledge this old in this much detail. Most of what we know about Neolithic life 9,000 years ago comes from fragments. A few bones here, a broken tool there. Atlit Yam is different. The seawater that buried it also preserved it, keeping organic material intact that would have rotted away on any dry land site within a few centuries. Which means archaeologists are not guessing at what life looked like here. They are reading it. The seeds tell you what they grew. The animal bones tell you what they herded and hunted. The fish bones tell you how close to the water they were already living. The human remains tell you something about the health of the population in its final years, and what they tell you is not entirely comfortable. By the time we are done going through all of this, you will have a clearer picture of who these people were, how they lived, what the physical evidence actually shows, and what it genuinely cannot answer. Because this is not a story with a clean ending. It is a story with a village, and then open water, and a gap in between that archaeology is still trying to close. If you are listening to this right now, wherever you are, I would genuinely like to know. Drop a comment with where you are, and what time it is there. It is one of my favourite things watching people fall asleep to these stories in completely different time zones all at once. Berlin at midnight, Sydney at dawn, someone in Toronto with headphones at 2 in the morning. Tell me where you are, and if you want to listen without any interruptions, no ads, no background music, just the story, you can follow the podcast on Spotify. The link is in the video description. It helps keep this going, and I appreciate it more than I can say. Now, a kilometer off the coast of Israel, 10 meters down, there is a village where fish swim through doorways that human hands built 9,000 years ago. Let's go find out what happened to it. The discovery did not begin with someone looking for a Neolithic village. It rarely does with underwater finds. It began with a survey. In the early 1980s, marine archaeologist Ehud Galili was conducting systematic work along the Israeli coastline, the kind of methodical, unglamorous documentation that most people never hear about, but that forms the backbone of what we actually know about the ancient world. The survey was partly about understanding what the shallow seafloor off the Carmel coast contained, whether there were shipwrecks, ancient harbours, artefacts moved around by currents and dredging. What it was not expecting to find was a village sitting more or less where it had always been. The site lies somewhere between 200 and 400 metres offshore, depending on which part of the settlement you're measuring from, at depths ranging from roughly 8 to 12 metres, but is shallow enough for scuba divers to work comfortably. It is not shallow enough to see from the surface. The stone walls and organic remains had been sitting there, largely invisible for the better part of 9,000 years. Underwater archaeology is slower than land archaeology, and harder in almost every respect. You cannot brush dirt off a surface with the same control when you're hovering in a current. You cannot make quick notes. You are always working against time in a way that has nothing to do with history and everything to do with how long your air lasts. The process at Atlit Yam involved establishing survey grids across the seafloor, the same basic logic as a land excavation, but requiring anchored lines and careful positioning to maintain any kind of spatial accuracy. Divers mapped stone features by hand, recorded the locations of artifacts relative to fixed reference points, and photographed everything before anything was moved. Some of the more fragile organic finds, the seeds, certain bone fragments, pieces of worked wood, required lifting in controlled conditions to prevent them from simply falling apart when exposed to air after so long under cold water. What made the recognition possible was the geometry. Natural seafloor scatter does not produce straight lines. It does not produce right angles. When divers began tracing what turned out to be stone wall foundations, the regularity was immediately apparent. These were not rocks that had tumbled into place. They were arranged. The same was true for the wells, circular stone-lined shafts sunk into the seafloor sediment, and for the semicircle of standing stones that sits near the centre of the site. None of these things look accidental once you see them. The preservation at Atlit Yam is the result of a specific set of circumstances that came together in an unusually favourable way. Sand burial was a major factor. Much of the site was covered relatively quickly by sediment, which protected it from wave action and from the kind of biological activity that destroys organic material on exposed seafloor. Certain areas also benefited from low oxygen pockets within the sediment, conditions that dramatically slow the decomposition of plant material, bone, and even some textiles. This is why seeds recovered from the site were identifiable thousands of years after they were stored. It is why animal bones retained enough information for species identification and butchery mark analysis. But preservation is never total. Wood structures that might have told us about roofing and construction are largely gone. Anything that required high oxygen to remain intact has not survived. The site gives generously in some areas and holds back completely in others, and that unevenness shapes everything archaeologists can and cannot say about it. What the surveys eventually revealed taken together is a settlement of meaningful size and organization. There are rectangular stone structures identified as dwellings, arranged across an area that suggests a community of perhaps a few dozen households. There are open spaces between structures that may have served as communal areas, animal pens, or working spaces. There are the 7 wells distributed across the site in a pattern that looks planned rather than improvised. There are areas of dense artifact scatter that indicate where daily activity concentrated. And there are human burials, some found beneath the floors of structures, in the way that many Neolithic communities across the region treated their dead. This is not a site that was thrown together and abandoned quickly. It has the layout of somewhere people expected to stay. The organization of space, the investment in permanent water infrastructure, the presence of burials beneath floors, these things speak to a community with roots, with memory, with intention. What ended that intention is the question that everything else in this story is slowly building toward. But before we can answer it, or try to, we need to understand when these people were actually living here, and what the world around them looked like when the village was still dry land. To place Atlit Yam in time, archaeologists didn't get a single neat date stamped on a stone. They built a window into the past out of fragments, each one carrying its own uncertainty, and then looked for where those fragments overlapped. When the first samples came up from the seafloor, the obvious move was radiocarbon dating. The village had given up exactly the kind of material that method needs: bits of charcoal from ancient hearths, animal bones with enough collagen still preserved, plant remains from stored grains and seeds that had been sealed away in low-oxygen sand. Each of these held the radioactive trace of carbon-14, slowly decaying from the moment the plant had died or the animal had stopped breathing. In the lab, technicians measured how much carbon-14 remained, compared it to modern levels, and calculated an age in radiocarbon years. But radiocarbon years are not calendar years. They have to be run through calibration curves built from tree rings and other independently dated records that show how atmospheric carbon has changed over time. Only after calibration do you get dates that can be plotted on an ordinary timeline. Those calibrated dates for Atlit Yam cluster in the late 8th millennium BCE, roughly between about 6,900 and 6,300 BCE, depending on the specific sample and the calibration model used. That is the time archaeologists in the Levant call the pre-pottery Neolithic C, or often just the late pre-pottery Neolithic. A period after farming and herding were already established in the region, but before fired pottery became a normal part of daily life. Radiocarbon alone, though, is never enough. A single piece of old wood reused in a younger house can drag your date backwards by centuries. A bone moved by burrowing animals can end up in the wrong layer. So archaeologists at Atlit Yam leaned heavily on context, on stratigraphy, the careful recording of where exactly each sample came from. Underwater, stratigraphy is more complicated. Layers are not clean bands of coloured soil like in a textbook. They are subtle changes in sediment texture and colour, shifts in the density of artefacts, transitions from buried surfaces to fill and back again. Divers working in grids mapped these micro-layers, noting which stones belonged to wall foundations, which patches of compacted sediment were original living floors, which deposits represented later infill as the site was slowly buried. Charcoal taken from a hearth sealed by a collapsed wall is different from charcoal loose in an open patch of sediment. A seed nestled in a storage pit cut into a floor tells a different chronological story than a seed found in a disturbed area near a well. Piece by piece, a relative sequence emerged. Houses built, wells dug, surfaces trampled, refuse accumulating, and then, eventually, the entire complex swallowed by sand and sea. When that stratigraphic sequence is combined with the radiocarbon series, the picture becomes clearer. Atlit Yam is not some Paleolithic camp or Bronze Age harbour. It sits at a very particular pivot point in Near Eastern prehistory, when small villages of farmers and herders had spread across the coastal plains and uplands, and when people were beginning to invest heavily in fixed places. Permanent houses, deliberate graves, wells sunk deep enough to outlast a single generation. Regionally, the pre-pottery Neolithic sea marks a shift from earlier experiments with cultivation to more entrenched agricultural lifeways. Emmer, wheat and barley are already domesticated here. Sheep, goats, cattle and pigs are being managed, not just hunted. Communities inland are growing denser, some with communal architecture and bounded spaces. On the coast, groups like the inhabitants of Atlit Yam are testing what it means to live with one foot in the sea and one in the fields. Fishing, shellfish gathering, and sea mammal hunting are being woven into a diet that also includes cereal grains, pulses, and meat from penned animals. Placing Atlit Yam in the late 8th millennium BCE also ties it into a larger environmental narrative. The last ice age had ended thousands of years earlier, but the world was still adjusting. Global sea levels had risen dramatically since the glacial maximum, tens of meters higher than when ice sheets had locked up water on land. By the time Atlit Yam was occupied, the rate of sea level rise was slowing compared to the explosive meltwater phases, but it had not stopped. The Mediterranean coastline was still creeping landward, sometimes steadily, sometimes in pulses. Low-lying areas that had been dry for generations could become marshy and then tidal within a few human lifespans. This matters for how we think about the village, but the dates themselves do not tell us the day the sea finally won. Radiocarbon cannot give you a calendar afternoon when everyone packed up and walked away. Even the best series of dates can only outline a span of human activity, earliest evidence of settlement, latest traces of use, and a broad window in which abandonment must have occurred. Without a sharp, easily identifiable event layer, a distinctive storm deposit, a tsunami sand sheet clearly draped over an intact occupation surface, the chronology of the final years remains blurred. At Atlit Yam, the evidence so far does not point to a single catastrophic moment neatly sealed in the sediments. Instead, the dates hint at something archaeologists call time averaging. What we see as one coherent village, frozen on the seafloor, may in fact be the accumulated residue of decades, perhaps centuries of repeated building, repair, abandonment of individual structures, and reoccupation nearby. A house whose stone foundations we map today might have been built early in the site's life, then remodelled, then partially dismantled as another structure went up a few meters away. A well that appears central in our plan could have been dug late in the settlement's history, replacing earlier water sources now invisible to us. Bones and seeds found on a single buried surface might come from multiple episodes of use, separated by seasons or years, blended together by trampling feet and later disturbances. From the diver's perspective, all of this collapses into a single tableau. Walls, wells, burials, artifacts, all lying together at the bottom of the sea. In human terms, though, Atlit Yam was a sequence, not a snapshot. Families were born and died there under changing skies and slowly changing shorelines. The radiocarbon dates, the stratigraphy, and the broader sea level context let us say roughly when this story unfolded. They do not yet tell us exactly how the last chapter was written. For that, we have to look more closely at where the sea once stopped, and how quickly it began to move inland. To understand that last chapter, you have to take the water away. Today, Atlit Yam lies about 8 to 12 meters below the surface of the Mediterranean, a few hundred meters offshore from the modern Israeli coast near Haifa. But when people were living there, around 6,900 to 6,300 BCE, the waves were not lapping at their doorsteps. The shoreline was farther out, beyond where divers can reach without gear, beyond the modern surf zone. The stone houses, the wells, the burials we see under the sea were laid out on what was then solid ground, a gently sloping coastal plain rising from the beach through low dunes and shallow depressions toward the inland hills. Reconstructing that ancient coastline is a bit like peeling back paint layers without ever scraping the wall. You cannot see the old beach directly, but you can infer where it was by combining several lines of evidence. Global sea level curves tell us that around 6,500 BCE, the Mediterranean was several meters lower than today. Local cores drilled off the Carmel coast show how sediment types change with depth, beach sands grading into nearshore silts, then into the finer muds that settle in deeper, calmer water. Somewhere in that vertical transition is the place where the waves used to break. When researchers map the sea floor around Atlit Yam with sonar and sub-bottom profilers, a ghost landscape appears. Beneath the modern blanket of marine muds, they pick up the buried contours of old dunes, levelled surfaces, and ancient channels. Stone features that used to sit on dry land now lie half-buried, their tops just protruding from the sediment. Put all this together, and a picture emerges of a village built not at the water's edge, but a modest walk inland, perhaps a few hundred meters, possibly as much as a kilometer from the contemporaneous shoreline. That choice makes sense. Neolithic people along the Carmel coast were not building seaside resorts. They were doing what humans have done in coastal zones all over the world, trying to get the benefits of the sea without the worst of its risks. Coastal plains in a Mediterranean climate are especially attractive. Winters bring most of the rain, often in short, intense bursts. Summers are long, hot and dry, but the soils, recharged by the wet season, can hold enough moisture to support cereals and legumes if they are managed carefully. Between the limestone ridge of Mount Carmel to the east and the sea to the west, water from seasonal rains gathers into small streams, springs and wetlands. Low spots hold groundwater close to the surface, making wells worthwhile. Floods spread fine sediments into shallow basins, creating fertile patches ideal for early agriculture. At Atlit Yam, the wells are a direct clue to this underground water world. Some were dug more than 5 meters deep, cutting through layers of soil and sand into the freshwater lens that floats on heavier seawater below. Around them, archaeologists have found plant remains that thrive in damp conditions, as well as bones from animals that would have grazed in nearby meadows and marshy edges. This was not a dry, wind-blown shore, it was a mosaic. Fields of emmer wheat and barley on slightly higher ground, patches of wild vegetation, and, in the low-lying areas, wetlands fed by seeps and small channels draining the Carmel slopes. The sea added another layer of resources. Fish, shellfish and marine mammals could be taken from relatively near-shore waters. Salt could be harvested from evaporated seawater in shallow pans or from naturally salty patches along the coast. The beach itself was not just a foraging zone, but a corridor. Moving along the coastline, whether by foot or small watercraft, linked Atlit Yam to other communities up and down the Levant. Even before formal harbours existed, coastal villages sat on what were effectively trade routes, exchanging obsidian, flint, shells, animal products, and perhaps ideas and spouses. Underwater topography helps fill in how people might have used this space. Slight ridges and terraces on the buried land surface mark former shore-parallel dunes or low rises. Depressions, some now silted up, were probably old stream channels or seasonal ponds. A village placed on a stable, slightly elevated tongue of land between two wet depressions would have had easy access to fresh water, pasturage, and routes to the beach, while staying above most seasonal flooding. All of this makes Atlit Yam look like a well-chosen home, close enough to the coast to exploit marine resources and coastal movement, but not so close that every winter storm would threaten to tear the houses apart. Yet that same geography holds the seed of the later problem. The low coastal plain that made agriculture and wells possible was also the part of the landscape most sensitive to rising seas. As the global ocean continued its slow climb after the last ice age, the ancient shoreline inched inland. What had been beach became backshore dunes. Wetlands crept landward as salty water pushed into formerly fresh channels. The freshwater lens shifted, the balance between wells and seawater changed. A settlement that began at a comfortable distance from the waves could find itself, generations later, in a zone where storm surges reached farther and salt intruded more often. We do not see that change directly. There is no ancient photograph of the waves moving closer year by year. Instead, the story is encoded in the sediments and in things small enough to fit on the head of a pin. Cores taken around Atlit Yam show layers rich in terrestrial plant pollen and freshwater mollusk shells overlain by layers where marine microfossils dominate. Tiny foraminifera that live only in seawater, dinoflagellate cysts associated with coastal marine conditions, fragments of marine shell. The grain size shifts too from coarser sands and silty soils, typical of a subaerial plain, to finer muds that settle out in quiet, shallow marine environments. Geochemists can sometimes detect changes in salinity in the pore waters trapped in those layers, or in the ratios of certain elements that signal increased marine influence. By stacking these clues, archaeologists and geologists can trace the slow but inexorable transformation of a dry inhabited landscape into seafloor. The wells that once tapped fresh water now sit submerged. House floors, once trampled by bare feet, lie under centimetres of marine sediment. A stone circle once above the tide line stands today in constant contact with salt water. This is the central tension built into Atlit Yam's geography. The villagers chose their location for reasons that were entirely rational in their own time. Reliable water, fertile soils, rich coastal resources, access to movement and exchange. The very features that made the site so attractive also placed it on a moving edge, a boundary that over centuries did not stay put. To see how that tension played out in the lives of the people themselves, though we need to look closer at the village as they built it. The houses they arranged on that disappearing plain, the routines that filled their days, and the ways they tried to make this shifting place feel like home. When divers first explored Atlit Yam, they were not swimming through intact houses. They were moving over low arcs and lines of stone barely rising from the seafloor, interrupted by patches of harder surface where centuries of waves had scoured away the softest sediments. From this, archaeologists have had to reconstruct an entire neighbourhood. Most of the buildings are defined by curving rows of medium-sized stones, forming rough ovals or rounded rectangles a few metres across. These are the foundations, the base courses of walls that would once have risen in mud brick, wattle and daub, or some mixture of organic materials that has long since vanished. Inside the stone rings, divers found compacted surfaces, thin, slightly hardened layers that differ from the surrounding sediments. Under a microscope, these layers look like trampled floors with crushed bits of bone, charcoal and plant material pressed into the matrix. On some of these floors sit hearths, shallow basins lined with stones reddened and cracked by heat, filled with charcoal and ash. In others, the fire traces are more diffuse, just concentrations of burned material in one corner of a room. Around them, scattered but not random, lie tools and waste flakes, bones from meals, and the occasional larger stone set upright, perhaps as a support for a post or a working surface. From this sparse material, a pattern of daily rhythms can be teased out, cautiously. Imagine a late spring morning in one of those houses. The hearth at the centre has burned down overnight. Someone refuels it with brushwood and small logs, coaxing it back to life. The presence of heat-altered stones, ash lenses and food bones clustered together tells us cooking happened here repeatedly in the same place. Fish vertebrae, sometimes still articulated, lie, mixed with the charred remains of cereal grains and pulses, evidence that meals combined marine resources with cultivated plants. Nearby, The stone tools shift our attention from eating to making. Atlit Yam has yielded dozens of flint blades and bladelets, some of them retouched along one edge into sickle elements. Under magnification, the edges of these sickle pieces show distinctive sheen and microscopic striations, a glossy silica-rich polish created by cutting large quantities of cereal stalks. Their distribution is telling. Many are found not in the houses themselves, but in small clusters just outside or in open areas between structures. That suggests that while the harvest happened out in the fields, the refitting, repair, and perhaps the binding of these elements into composite sickles may have been an outdoor task, done in shared workspaces rather than inside individual homes. Scrapers and retouched flakes tell another part of the story. Their edges bear wear patterns consistent with working hides and wood, rounded microchipping where they were pushed against soft, resistant materials, residues of animal fat trapped in tiny cracks. These tools are often found nearer to the hearths and within the house foundations, implying that processing skins, preparing leather, or shaping small wooden objects could have been part of indoor, perhaps evening, activity, tasks carried out while food simmered and conversations continued. Heavier ground stone tools add still more layers to these quiet routines. Querns and grinding stones made from basalt and limestone sit in specific parts of the site, usually within or right beside houses. Their upper surfaces carry the telltale smoothness and shallow grooves of repeated grinding. Starch grains recovered from their surfaces point to cereals and legumes being processed here, while traces of wild plants hint at a broader range of foods. The clustering of these grinding stones suggests dedicated food processing spots, perhaps the corner of a room where someone knelt, day after day, turning harvested grain into flour. Childhood hides in subtler hints, small lithic flakes in the same rooms as the grinding stones, some too small and irregular to be useful, may be debris from tool production. But mixed among them are tiny artifacts with unusually steep retouch or odd shaping that some researchers cautiously interpret as practice pieces. The early efforts of young knappers learning to control the fracture of flint. If that reading is right, tool repair and training happened side by side. Adults maintaining functional equipment while children imitated their gestures at the margins of the workspace. Special patterns across the settlement suggest that not every house did everything. In some areas, bones with butchery marks, cut and smashed for marrow, concentrate in open spaces between structures rather than inside them. The same zones hold high densities of larger flint flakes and cores, indicating primary tool production. Here the rhythm might have been noisier, carcasses brought in from hunts or herding grounds, stripped and divided, new blades struck from carefully prepared cores, broken sickle elements replaced. The houses around these shared yards may have benefited from a collective butchering and knapping area, while maintaining more restricted spaces inside for sleeping, storage, and quieter tasks. Other houses with fewer heavy tools and more fine blades and ornaments might have been used differently, perhaps as domestic spaces with less emphasis on production, or as places where certain types of work occurred seasonally. At a coastal village like this, seasonal rhythms would have been strong. Late spring and early summer could have meant intensive cereal processing, sickles in use, grinding stones working overtime, storage pits being filled. Autumn might have shifted focus toward herds and wild game, with more butchery debris and hide-working tools in use. Net sinkers, fish bones, and certain shell species hint that particular seasons also brought intensive fishing. The distribution of these remains, layered in the sediments, can track how the village's tasks waxed and waned over the year. None of this is straightforward. Archaeologists are working with tiny differences in artifact densities, subtle variations in wear, and chemical traces that can be ambiguous. A flint blade with edge damage could have been used to cut plants, meat, or even soft wood. Only detailed use-wear analysis and residue studies narrow down the options, and even then, more than one interpretation can fit. A concentration of bones might be a dumping area, a butchery spot, or the remains of a carnivore's activity. Hearths may have been used for cooking, but also for craft work that required controlled heat, like drying fish or processing plant fibers. The underwater context adds another layer of uncertainty. Currents can move light artifacts. Marine organisms can burrow, mix, and obscure surfaces. Not every stone ring is necessarily a house. Some could be pens, storage structures, or features whose purpose we no longer recognize. Patterns that look like intentional zoning, this area for food, that area for tools, could partly reflect how the site was buried and eroded rather than how it was lived. So when we talk about cooking corners, napping yards, or childcare in the doorway, we are talking about probabilities, about scenarios that fit the physical evidence without being the only possible story. The stone foundations, the hearths, the worn grinding slabs, and the microscopic scratches on flint edges do not tell us who laughed where or whose hands learned to shape a blade. They simply mark where certain energies were repeatedly focused. Within those traces, though, you can sense a steady, almost unremarkable intimacy with the place. Fire relit in the same spots year after year. Tools reworked on the same patches of ground. Food prepared and eaten along familiar paths between house and yard, hearth and work area. Before the sea arrived, Atlit Yam was not a mystery. It was home in all the ordinary ways that word implies. To see how that ordinariness intersected with the extraordinary environment around them, we need to step just outside these walls to the wells that still sit where the villagers dug them, and to the secrets that settled, grain by grain, at their muddy bottoms. Step out from the low stone walls and you encounter something different. Not a hearth, not a work surface, but deep, circular cuts into the ancient ground, lined with stones that drop out of sight. These are the wells of Atlit Yam, and in many ways they are the clearest signatures that this place was meant to last. Archaeologists pay special attention to wells because people do not dig them casually. A well takes time, coordination, and planning. You have to know where fresh water sits under your feet, understand how it rises and falls through the year, and be willing to invest labour into a feature that only makes sense if you expect to be here for a while. In a world of seasonal camps and shifting encampments, a lined well on a flat coastal plain is a declaration: we live here. At Atlit Yam, several such wells have been found, some as much as a few metres deep, their stone linings still coherent under the sea. When they were first used, the shoreline would have been hundreds of metres away. This was not a beachside pit catching occasional runoff. It was a carefully engineered opening into the freshwater lens that forms beneath permeable coastal sediments. The villagers were tapping a hidden, replenishing reservoir, a quiet partnership with the geology under their feet. A well like this changes everything about daily life. Instead of walking to a distant spring or stream, people could draw water within or just beyond the cluster of houses. That means less time spent in transit, more flexibility in when and how water-intensive tasks are done. Cooking, soaking hides, washing plant fibres, watering tethered animals in dry spells. It also hints at some form of collective management. A well is a shared focal point. Someone repairs the lining stones when they shift. Someone clears out fallen debris. Someone decides when the water has gone bad enough that the well should be deepened, cleaned, or abandoned. And then there is the other reason wells matter to archaeologists. They are traps. Once a well is no longer drawing clean water, it tends to become a convenient hole. People toss things into it: broken tools, food waste, unwanted bones. Wind and rain carry seeds, pollen and dust down its shaft. Small animals fall in and die. Over time, layer after layer of material accumulates at the bottom, often in a protected, oxygen-poor environment that can preserve fragile remains far better than open-air surfaces ever could. In the wells of Atlit Yam, this process has left a dense archive. Charred seeds and plant fragments settle in with wind-blown grains of pollen, creating a time-averaged record of what was growing nearby and what people were eating. Animal bones, sometimes tiny and delicate, testify to the presence of fish, small mammals, birds, and even invertebrates. Some may be deliberate discard, others may be victims of a fall. Broken flint pieces, snapped grinding stone fragments, and other odds and ends mark the quiet afterlife of tools once they were no longer useful. Even the sediments themselves carry information. Fine layers of silt, coarser sands, lenses of organic rich mud. Under careful analysis, these can reveal shifts in erosion, vegetation cover, and water movement around the settlement. Microbes and chemical signatures, traces of nitrates, phosphates, salt, can indicate when the well was still pulling good fresh water and when it began to turn sour. Why would a community abandon a well they had worked so hard to build? One reason could be contamination. If animal waste, decomposing carcasses, or simply too much organic material entered the water column, the well might have become a hazard. Illness following its use would be an unmistakable signal, even if the villagers had no germ theory. Another reason is physical damage. A collapsed lining, a major shift in the surrounding sediments, or a sudden influx of sand from a storm could make repair more trouble than starting fresh somewhere else. But on this low-lying coastal plain, another quiet process was at work: salinization. Underneath a coastline like the one that once existed here, fresh groundwater floats as a lens atop saltwater. As the sea level rises, that saltwater pushes inland and upward. Long before the waves actually reach a village, the invisible boundary between fresh and brackish water can begin to move. A well that once gave clear, sweet water might, over a few generations, start to taste faintly salty. Over time, that hint of salt could strengthen until the water was no longer acceptable for drinking. This kind of salinity intrusion does not leave a dramatic, singular mark. There is no obvious salt flood layer. Instead, it creeps. Grain by grain, tide by tide, the balance shifts. In the sediments at the bottom of a well, that shift might show up only as subtle changes in mineral composition, in the shells of microscopic organisms, in the chemical residues left on the walls and in the fill. It takes detailed geochemical work to see such signals, and even then, the interpretation is cautious. Increased salinity could be linked to regional sea level rise. It could also reflect local overuse, changing drainage, or combinations of factors we cannot fully disentangle. A falling water table is another possibility. If climate conditions shifted, if rainfall patterns changed, or if too many people and animals were drawing on the same freshwater lens, the accessible water level in a particular well might have dropped beyond reach. Deepening the shaft is sometimes possible, but there are limits before the risk of collapse, or the onset of brackish water makes further digging pointless. A dry or unreliable well quickly loses its central role in daily life. Archaeologists looking into these stone-lined shafts now filled with sediment are essentially reading the last chapters of their biographies. The topmost layers usually contain clear evidence of deliberate filling, rubble, discarded artifacts, domestic waste. That suggests people chose to close these wells, turning them from water sources into convenient pits. Below that, the sequence tends to become more natural, gradual, fine sediments washed in, occasional items fallen or tossed in, traces of waterlogging or drying cycles. What we would love to find is a sharp diagnostic event layer, something that clearly marks a sudden change. A distinct band of marine shells where there had been none before, for instance, might point to a storm surge or rapid saltwater intrusion. A layer of collapsed stones intermixed with domestic debris might signal a catastrophic collapse or a single episode of intentional demolition. At Atlit Yam, the record is subtler. The fills appear to reflect slow processes, piecemeal discard and gradual abandonment, rather than one obvious disaster captured in a single band of sediment. That subtlety is both a limitation and a gift. Without a crisp event layer, we cannot say, here is the moment the sea took the well, or here is the year they gave up on this water source. Instead, we see trends, a shift in what kinds of seeds appear, changes in the proportion of marine to terrestrial microfossils, variations in salinity indicators. These suggest evolving conditions and responses, but they stop short of narrating them for us. Still, even within that ambiguity, the wells of Atlit Yam speak clearly of intent and adaptation. They tell us this was a community that understood its landscape deeply enough to tap hidden water, monitor its quality, and eventually make decisions about when to relocate that precious resource. They also show how vulnerable that understanding was to changes just beyond human control. Subtle movements of the freshwater lens, the slow inland advance of the sea. As we follow those clues further, from the water drawn up in clay vessels to the fields that depended on it, the story of Atlit Yam widens again, out across the damp soils of the coastal plain, where people tried to coax crops from ground that was always, quietly, connected to the sea. Follow that water outward, and you reach the real gamble of life at Atlit Yam, the fields. We are used to thinking of early farming as something that happens on river terraces or inland plains, safely away from the shifting edge of the sea. But around 6,900 to 6,300 BCE, when Atlit Yam was occupied, people along the eastern Mediterranean coast were already experimenting with a more delicate arrangement. They were trying to raise crops on land that was low, flat, and never entirely free from the influence of salt. The plant remains from Atlit Yam are fragmentary, and always filtered through the ways we recover them. When archaeologists excavate here, they do not just lift stones and collect obvious artifacts. They also take buckets of sediment from hearths, pits, and the fills of those abandoned wells, then run them through water in a process called flotation. Charred seeds and tiny plant fragments, lighter than the surrounding soil, rise to the surface and are skimmed off. Heavier bits sink and are sorted separately. Under a microscope, the outlines of cereal grains, legume seeds, and chaff begin to emerge. From this kind of work, a familiar cast of plants shows up, echoing what we know from other Neolithic sites in the Levant. Domesticated wheat, often emmer or einkorn and barley appear, sometimes as whole charred grains, sometimes as broken pieces fused into ancient bread-like lumps. Legumes, especially lentils and peas, leave behind their own distinctive seeds. There are also hints of wild plants, fig, maybe wild fruit stones, bits of gathered greens. The exact list depends on which samples you look at, and new discoveries can still shift it, but the overall impression is clear. This was not a purely foraging community that just happened to live near the sea. Atlit Yam was part of the early farming world. Beyond the naked eye, there is a second layer of evidence. Pollen grains survive in sediments, each species sculpted into a miniature, species-specific form. Phytoliths, tiny silica bodies that form inside plant tissues, can endure long after the plant itself has rotted away. When these microbotanical remains are extracted from soil samples on and around house floors, hearths, and within well fills, patterns begin to form. Certain phytolith shapes point to grasses, including cereals. Others suggest reeds and wetland plants, perhaps brought in as thatch or fodder. Together they sketch a landscape where cultivated fields, damp margins, and natural vegetation coexisted in close proximity. Inside the houses, the tools of this farming life sit where they fell. Large, heavy grinding stones, basalt or limestone querns, rest on packed floors, sometimes paired with handstones polished by thousands of repetitive strokes. These are not opportunistic tools. They are fixtures built into daily routines of cracking, grinding and sieving grain. Flint blades with glossy, sickle-like wear on their edges hint at reaping. Repetitive cutting of silica-rich cereal stems polishes the stone in a distinctive way, leaving a sheen that can still be seen under strong light today. Hearths add another piece. Their ash layers sometimes contain burnt chaff, weed seeds and other agricultural waste swept up with the fuel. In some houses, concentrations of charred grain and the layout of adjacent features have led researchers to suggest the presence of small storage areas, niches, bins, perhaps even above-ground granaries now lost, but implied by post holes and floor discolorations. None of this matches the big communal silos of later village life, but it does indicate planning beyond the next meal. People here were not just eating what they gathered each day, they were trying to smooth out the sharp edges of seasonal abundance and scarcity. On this coastal plain, that planning had to be tightly timed. Cereal crops in this region depend on the winter rains. Fields would have been sown in the cooler, wetter months, when the groundwater lens was high and the soil held moisture. Spring brought rapid growth and then a narrow harvest window before the full heat of the dry season. Harvest too early, and the grains are soft and low in yield. Too late, and storms, wind, or a spike in humidity can ruin standing crops. Living so close to the sea added its own layer of uncertainty. Coastal weather can turn abruptly. A late rain squall, a spell of unseasonal humidity, or a storm-driven flood from landward wadis could flatten or soak ripening fields. Salt-laden winds during a dry spell could burn delicate plant tissues at the very moment farmers hoped to secure their surplus. And beneath it all, the slow, almost invisible processes affecting the freshwater lens, salinity creeping upward, the water table rising or falling, would have shaped how reliably those crops could be planted in the same places year after year. Because of that, farming at Atlit Yam was unlikely to stand alone. The same flotation samples that yield cereal grains also turn up wild seeds, suggesting people continued to gather plants from surrounding scrub and wetland, edible greens, nuts, perhaps reeds used for matting and construction. The wells and adjacent deposits are rich in animal remains and marine indicators, which we will come back to, but even now they remind us that cereals and legumes were only one arm of a broader subsistence strategy. When a field failed, you could fish. When storms churned the shallows and muddied the catches, you could lean more heavily on stored grain and pulses. When both were thin, wild foods and whatever could be gleaned from the margins might bridge the gap. This kind of mixed economy, part farmer, part forager, part shoreline specialist, creates a particular kind of security. It allows a community to stay put, to invest in wells, houses, grinding stones and social ties anchored to one place, without being entirely at the mercy of a single resource. At the same time, it also ties that security to a very specific configuration of land and water. The freshwater lens must stay sweet enough. The soils must remain only lightly salted, just arable enough for wheat and barley to take root. The coastal ecosystem must continue to offer fish, shellfish, seagrasses, and migratory birds in roughly predictable patterns. As long as those conditions hold, a village like Atlit Yam can feel stable, even permanent. Children can grow up in the same house where their parents and grandparents once ground grain and mended nets. The wells keep flowing, the fields keep giving, the shoreline keeps offering its shifting but familiar harvest. But if any part of that delicate balance begins to drift, if the rains shift, if the sea rises just enough to nudge salt into the groundwater, if storms start to bite deeper into the plain, then the very investments that once anchored the community become points of vulnerability. The grinding stones are too heavy to move far. The wells cannot simply be picked up and carried inland. The fields cannot be detached from the thin, precarious band of soil where freshwater and saltwater still negotiate. Food security and settlement permanence are joined here, but so are permanence and risk. To understand how that played out for the people of Atlit Yam, we have to step away from the fields and look at the rest of their food web, at the animals they kept, the hunts they undertook, and the shoreline that both fed them and, eventually, rose above them. Step away from the fields and you walk into another part of Atlit Yam's economy, the animals that walked, grazed, and swam around the village. When archaeologists dug through the fills of wells, the floors of houses, and the trashy edges of the site, they found bones. Lots of bones. Not just the scattered remains of hunted wild game, but patterns that look very much like managed herds. Cattle, sheep, and goats all show up in the assemblage, and they do not appear in random proportions. Take the cattle first. At this time in the Levant, around the 7th millennium BCE, people were already starting to manage and domesticate local aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cows. At Atlit Yam, cattle bones include individuals that died at ages which make more sense for a herding strategy than for opportunistic hunting. You see some younger animals likely killed for meat when their growth made them efficient food sources. You also see older individuals, especially females, that seem to have lived long enough to have been valuable for milk or for breeding. If you were just hunting wild cattle when you could, you would expect more very young and prime-age kills, animals you could most easily ambush or chase down. The age profile here leans toward deliberate management. Sheep and goats tell a similar story. Their bones show a spread of ages that fits with controlled culling. Many are killed in the first couple of years of life, old enough to have grown to a useful size, young enough that you are not wasting years of feed and labour on non-productive mouths. A smaller number live on into adulthood, probably as breeding stock or milk producers. Under a microscope, the bones bear cut marks in predictable places, around joints where limbs were separated, along ribs and vertebrae where meat was sliced away, near horn cores where skulls were processed. These are not the sporadic marks of rare feasts. They are the repetitive traces of everyday butchery. Herd management shows up in subtler ways too. Pathologies, changes in bone shape and texture, hint at animals that spent a lot of time near people. Some limb bones show stress that can come from tethering or from walking repeatedly over similar ground, rather than roaming freely over large territories. Horn and skull measurements in some specimens fall into the size ranges usually associated with early domesticates rather than full-sized wild ancestors, though the distinction in this period is often a matter of degrees. All of it points toward people who were not only chasing animals but shaping their lives. That does not mean they abandoned hunting. Wild species still appear in the bone record: deer, wild boar, perhaps the occasional gazelle. These animals seem to have been taken less predictably, adding variety and fat to the diet when opportunities arose. Their age profiles skew more toward prime adults, the kind of animals you are most likely to target when stalking game. Some bones show impact fractures associated with projectiles. Others carry distinctive spiral breaks and percussion marks that suggest people were cracking them open to get at marrow and brain, the richest fats available in a lean season. But if the fields and herds tied Atlit Yam to the land, the sea wrapped around everything else. Fish remains are everywhere: vertebrae, jawbones, stubborn little otoliths, the ear stones that sometimes survive when everything else has decayed. Many of these belong to species that favour shallow, near-shore waters: groupers, sparids, mullets, and others that haunt rocky bottoms and sandy shallows. The size ranges suggest people were catching a mix of small and medium fish rather than specialising solely in giant trophy animals. That pattern fits well with net fishing, traps, and lines set in predictable spots along the coast. Shellfish add another layer. Piles of mollusk shells accumulate in some areas, with species that tend to live on intertidal rocks or buried just below the surface of sandy and muddy substrates. Some shells show chipping or breakage patterns that suggest deliberate opening techniques rather than random damage. Others bear small polish or wear on their edges, hinting they might have been reused as scrapers or small tools after the meat was eaten. Crustaceans and other marine invertebrates likely filled in the gaps, though their remains are more fragile and harder to track. The toolkit that made this shoreline harvest possible has only partly survived. Stone net weights, small stones with grooves or notches, turn up in contexts that make sense if people were setting nets in the shallows or from simple boats. Bone and perhaps early copper hooks appear at other Neolithic coastal sites in the region, and Atlit Yam sits right in that tradition, even if not every artifact is preserved or recognized. Flint blades and scrapers, some with edge damage consistent with cutting soft animal tissue or scraping fish scales and skins, complete the picture. Alongside them, grinding stones and smaller abraders may have been used to process shell necklaces and tools, but also to smooth wooden implements related to fishing and trapping. From the perspective of a single meal, this looks like abundance. Meat from cattle, goats and sheep, stews thickened with lentils and barley, fish roasted or dried, shellfish boiled or baked in their shells. From the perspective of long-term survival, it looks like strategy. Dietary diversity spreads risk. If a dry year cuts pasture and reduces milk yields, the sea can still supply protein. If a storm churns the shallows and scatters fish, stored grain and pulses from the fields can carry the village through. If disease hits the herd, hunting and shoreline gathering can step in. Stable isotope analysis of human bones from the site, looking at ratios of carbon and nitrogen, suggests a mixed diet with both terrestrial and marine protein contributing. The exact balance is still debated. Isotopes reflect broad trends, not detailed menus. But they confirm what the bones already hint at. No single source of food dominated absolutely. Residues add another layer of nuance. Traces left inside pottery sherds or absorbed into stone tools can sometimes be teased out with chemical analysis. At Atlit Yam and comparable sites, residues point toward animal fats, sometimes dairy, mixed with plant oils and occasionally compounds characteristic of marine organisms. This is not yet a fully painted picture. Preservation is patchy, and methods are still improving. But even the partial signals show that people combine their resources in complex ways, cooking land and sea together. And yet, the same variety that made Atlit Yam resilient also held the community in place. Herds need pasture close enough to water. Fields need that fragile lens of fresh groundwater beneath the coastal plain. Nearshore fish and shellfish require shallow, accessible banks and rocky outcrops within daily reach. The isotope profiles that show mixed diets are also signatures of a very particular landscape, where freshwater arable soil and a productive coastline meet in a narrow band. As we follow the evidence deeper into this band, into where people lived, died, and were buried, we start to see how tightly their lives were woven into this strip of land. The bones do not only lie in trash heaps, some of them lie under floors. At Atlit Yam, the dead were not taken far away. They stayed in the middle of things. When divers and archaeologists mapped the site, they began to notice something peculiar. Human skeletons were turning up not in a separate cemetery on the edge of the settlement, but within the built-up zone itself, in open spaces between structures, in what looked like courtyards, and in several cases directly beneath the floors of houses. People here seem to have dug shallow pits inside or beside their dwellings, laid bodies in them, and then covered them over, sometimes rebuilding or repairing the surface above. Daily life went on literally over the top of the dead. That choice is not random. You do not put a body under your floor by accident. In many Neolithic communities around the eastern Mediterranean, burying the dead within the settlement seems to have been one way of keeping ancestry close. A house was not just a shelter, it was a container for relationships that stretched backward in time. Parents, grandparents, perhaps children, some of them may have remained physically present in the place their family continued to inhabit. At Atlit Yam, that pattern likely held, though the exact kin ties are not always clear. DNA preservation underwater is tricky, and the sample sizes are small. But the simple fact that burials cluster within the living area suggests they were not anonymous burials. They were specific people, known to specific households. Imagine what that does to the feel of a place. You sleep, cook, and work above the buried bodies of those who shaped your life. When you repair a wall or tamp down a floor, you're also maintaining a connection with whoever lies beneath it. Memory is not just something told, it is under your feet. Some burials at Atlit Yam are single individuals. Others hold more than one person. In at least one case, a woman and child appear to have been buried together, their bodies carefully placed. The positions of limbs, the orientation of the skeletons, these details matter. They suggest intentional arrangement, not just quick disposal. Osteology, the close study of bones, lets us push a little further into who these people were. Human remains from Atlit Yam cover a spread of ages. There are adults in their prime years, older individuals with worn joints and degenerative changes, and younger people, including children. Sex estimation based on pelvic shape and skull features shows both male and female skeletons. This was not a burial ground reserved only for one segment of society, like elders or infants. The dead seem to represent a cross-section of the community. Bones also carry traces of the stresses these people lived with. Healed fractures tell of accidents or perhaps occasional violence, and whether those injuries had time to mend. Joint surfaces show wear consistent with repetitive tasks, lifting, grinding, walking long distances. Enamel defects on teeth record episodes of childhood stress, when illness or malnutrition interrupted normal growth. Taken together, these marks show lives of steady physical labour punctuated by harder times. Some skeletons show pathological changes that go beyond ordinary wear and tear. Certain vertebrae and rib lesions at Atlit Yam have drawn special attention because of what they might mean. They look to some researchers like they could be consistent with an infectious disease that still troubles people today, tuberculosis. If that diagnosis is right, it would be one of the earlier clear cases of TB in the world, and it would tie the story of Atlit Yam into the wider question of how diseases evolved alongside settled human communities and their animals. Close quarters, shared water sources, growing populations, and the presence of domesticated cattle all create the kind of environment where pathogens that move between animals and humans can thrive. But here the story needs to slow down, not speed up. Ancient disease diagnosis is difficult. Bone changes can have multiple causes. Lesions that look like tuberculosis at first glance might also result from other chronic infections, from different stresses, or even from post-burial changes. To be confident, archaeologists and bioanthropologists try to combine several lines of evidence: the pattern and location of bone damage, microscopic structure, any preserved DNA fragments from pathogens, and ideally comparisons with large samples from similar contexts. At Atlit Yam, some researchers have reported molecular traces consistent with Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the bacterium responsible for TB, in combination with skeletal changes that fit the expected pattern. Others urge caution, pointing out limitations of preservation, sample size, and the risk of contamination in such ancient material. The debate is not fully settled, and may never be, given the age and condition of the remains. So it is safest to say this: there are signs of serious chronic illness in at least some of the Atlit Yam skeletons, and those signs may include early evidence of tuberculosis. That possibility fits broader theories about the rise of infectious diseases in Neolithic communities, but it cannot yet be treated as unquestionable fact. Even without a firm label, though, illness has consequences. A community coping with chronic disease has to make choices. Sick individuals need care, food, water, time, attention from healthy members who could otherwise be tending fields or herds. If a disease spreads easily, people may experiment with changing sleeping arrangements, separating the sick, or in later periods, reorganizing settlements. If the disease seems tied to particular animals or water sources, that might feed into discussions, spoken or unspoken, about where to move herds, when to abandon a well, or whether to consider shifting camp entirely. But those are long arcs of decision-making. They do not reduce to a single dramatic moment, a single conversation where someone says, "We are leaving because of disease." Atlit Yam's history was likely shaped by overlapping pressures, shifting groundwater, storms, shoreline erosion, economic opportunities, social tensions, and, among them, the slow grinding weight of illness. Under the floors, the bones capture one dimension of that story: who lived, who died, and how they were remembered. Above them, people kept living, caring for children, tending fires, mending nets, while the sea quietly worked at the edges of their world. Those quiet burials set the mood for another unresolved feature of Atlit Yam: a ring of stones standing where the waves roll now, hinting at rituals and meanings we can only partially recover. Out beyond the clustered house foundations and the buried dead, there is something else. If you swim across the site today, you come to a low, open area where the seafloor rises just slightly, like a shallow platform. On that platform stands a ring of stones. They are not towering monoliths like Stonehenge. These are modest in size, about 1 metre high, 1.5 meters at most. But they are upright, they are arranged, and some of them have been worked. Archaeologists mapped them carefully. 7 large stones forming an arc, set upright in a roughly semicircular or horseshoe pattern. Each one anchored in place in a shallow pit, chocked with smaller stones so they would stand firm. They are not random boulders left by an ancient shoreline. They were quarried from nearby, moved here, and planted. A few of the stones bear shallow cut marks on their upper surfaces, small rounded depressions pecked into the rock. Not natural erosion, but deliberate modification. Inside the arc, on the seafloor between these standing stones, divers found something else: a concentration of pits, stains, and stone basins that do not match ordinary house floors or trash areas. At least one of the basins shows traces of having held water. Others may have been used for soaking, grinding, or mixing. Put all of that together, and this patch of seabed begins to look less like another dwelling and more like a place set aside. A constructed focus point in the middle of a low-lying area that was once dry ground. What was it for? One straightforward interpretation is that this was a communal gathering space. A place where people from different households came together when something needed to involve more than one family: discussions, agreements, feasts, or decisions about herds and fields. The ring of stones might have helped define a boundary. Inside is where the group meets. Outside is ordinary space. Another possibility is that it marked something more specific: water. When you look at the original topography reconstructed from cores and sonar scans, this stone circle sits near the point where fresh groundwater would have come closest to the surface. It is not far from one of the wells, and the arrangement suggests that water, whether seeping, pooling, or simply known to lie just below, was a key part of its meaning. Those shallow basins inside the ring, some of them apparently used to collect or manipulate water, reinforce that link. This could have been a place where water was drawn, stored, blessed, or observed. That edge between land and water has always carried extra weight in human imaginations. Springs, wells, and seeps in many cultures become focal points, places where offerings accumulate, where stories cluster, where the invisible feels a little closer. In a settlement that depended on balancing fresh water from wells with salt water from the sea, a spot where the ground literally sweated drinkable water would have been crucial. Ritual is one word for the extra attention we give to such places. But archaeologists are cautious about that word. Ritual can easily become a placeholder for "we don't know what else to call it." So there are criteria, informal but widely used, before that label is even tentatively applied. Context is the first. Is the feature embedded in normal domestic space, Or does it stand apart? The Atlit Yam stone circle is not inside a house. It sits in a kind of open zone, without the usual scatter of hearths, post holes and floor levels that mark everyday living. Repetition is another. Do similar features appear in more than one place or layer, suggesting a pattern? At Atlit Yam, this exact stone ring is unique on the site, but comparable arrangements of standing stones and basin-like features show up at other pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the Levant and Anatolia. Not identical, but similar enough to suggest a shared habit of marking special places with stones and carved depressions. Then there is unusual placement. Stones that take effort to move and set upright have to earn their keep. If they stand somewhere that does not make much sense for storage, shelter, or simple convenience, that strangeness itself is meaningful. The Atlit Yam stones do not support a roof. They are not retaining a terrace. They frame an open patch of ground, finely associated finds. Do you see particular kinds of artifacts or substances around them? Burnt offerings, animal bones in unusual combinations, rare objects, pigments or residues. At Atlit Yam, the picture is suggestive but not decisive. There are some animal bones and stone tools in and around the circle, but no clear altars, no obvious offerings that shout ceremony. If anything, the traces point to repeated small-scale activities, pouring, soaking, maybe slaughtering or processing animals nearby, rather than rare one-off events. Put together, these clues nudge interpretation towards some kind of communal, possibly ceremonial use, strongly tied to water, a place you return to again and again, to do slightly unusual things in a slightly unusual way. It is easy from a distance of 9,000 years and several meters of seawater to let the imagination run far beyond that. Stone circles beneath the sea naturally invite comparisons with myths about drowned cities and lost civilizations. Atlantis inevitably gets mentioned whenever people hear ancient structures under the water, but there is a gap between cultural echo and evidence. Atlit Yam is firmly rooted in the known world of the pre-pottery Neolithic, around 6,900 to 6,300 BCE. Its houses, tools, animal bones and plant remains match what we see at contemporary inland sites. The stone circle belongs to that same horizon, a local expression of a broader Neolithic way of life, not a trace of an unknown super-civilization. What is fascinating is not that it supports Atlantis-like stories, but that it shows how real Neolithic communities were already doing something we might recognize as sacred or symbolic, with no need to stretch into legend. Even so, questions remain. Why this exact arrangement of 7 stones? Why this precise spot? A short walk from houses and burials, but not directly attached to either. Who was allowed inside the ring? Everyone, or only certain people at certain times? Did the cut marks hold offerings, or water, or pigments, or something we have no word for? And perhaps most importantly, what made it important enough that people were willing to drag heavy stones, dig careful sockets, and renew the area over time? We do not have answers. We have only the stubborn fact of shaped rock standing where no natural process would have put it, clustered near ancient wells on ground that is seafloor now. The people of Atlit Yam chose to inscribe meaning into their landscape in stone, at a place where water gathered, and the ground was thin above whatever lay beneath. Long after their houses collapsed and their fields disappeared under rising tides, that ring still stands, keeping its secret. Not far from it, other traces hint that the settlement was facing pressures more immediate than mystery, the kind of stresses that push communities to gather, to consult, and eventually, perhaps, to leave. Stress leaves marks, even when nobody writes them down. At Atlit Yam, those marks are subtle. There is no layer of ash, no smashed walls, no mass grave that announces a single terrible day. Instead, the signs are scattered through the quiet things, in how the water changed, how the shore moved, how people adjusted what they grew and ate. To understand those signs, You have to picture the village in its last centuries, not as a suddenly drowned town, but as a low-lying coastal community living with a sea that was rising year after year. Global sea level around 7,000–6,000 BCE was not static. As the great ice sheets of the last glacial period finished melting, the oceans kept creeping upward, by meters over centuries, by centimeters within a lifetime. Atlit Yam sits today about 8 to 12 meters below the surface. But when people lived there, it was on dry land just a few meters above a shoreline that was edging inland. Before the sea ever washed across their doorways, it would have seeped in from below. When sea level climbs against a permeable coast, the underground lens of fresh water that feeds springs and wells begins to shift. The balance between fresh groundwater flowing off the land and salt water pressing in from the sea tips. Even if the houses and fields remain dry, the water beneath them changes character. This is one of the clearest stress signals at Atlit Yam. The wells that once delivered clean, sweet water started to betray hints of the sea. Chemical analysis of the sediments and encrustations inside some of those well shafts shows rising salinity over time. The lower layers, corresponding to the early use of the wells, are consistent with fresh groundwater. Higher up, closer to the later phases of occupation, you begin to see signatures of brackish water, a mix of fresh and salty. In practical terms, that means everyday tasks slowly became harder. Cooking, brewing, washing, watering animals, all of it depended on reliable fresh water. A slightly salty taste might be tolerable at first, but for crops and for infants it quickly becomes a problem. People may have had to walk farther to fetch water from less affected sources or dig new wells uphill, away from the creeping influence of the sea. The ground itself would have been changing too. Rising groundwater saturates low-lying soils. What was once firm earth can become seasonally waterlogged or marshy. Roots rot more easily, house floors need more maintenance. Latrines, trash pits, and working areas don't drain as well. You can see hints of this in the microstratigraphy, patches of fine, water-laid sediments in areas that once lay between structures, suggesting periodic standing water in what had been dry yards. Salt intrusion does more than foul wells. It infiltrates fields. Many of the crops grown at Atlit Yam, emmer wheat, barley, lentils, can tolerate only limited salinity. As salty water rises closer to the surface, plants begin to yellow and fail. Harvests become less predictable. Marginal plots near the shoreline likely dropped out of use first, pushing cultivation gradually inland or upslope. And then there is the shoreline itself. You don't need a giant wave to erase a beach. Ordinary storms working year after year can rework a coast beyond recognition. A series of powerful winter storms can strip away dunes, cut new inlets, or undercut low bluffs where people once walked and worked. Atlit Yam sat on a gently sloping coastal plain. As sea level rose, storm waves would have reached farther inland, biting into the soft sediments that had supported houses, paths, and working areas. Even without a catastrophic tsunami, one bad storm season could have toppled flimsy structures near the water's edge, flooded storage pits, and washed away parts of the settlement margin. Archaeologists see traces of this in the patterning of features. Certain peripheral areas contain disturbed deposits, rolled stones, reworked shells, jumbled animal bones that look less like ordinary trash and more like material rearranged by energetic water. The core of the village remains relatively intact, but the edges show scars of erosion. All of this, the brackish wells, the soggy ground, the gnawed-away shoreline, points to environmental stress building over more than one generation. A slow squeeze, not an overnight disaster, but environmental pressure rarely acts alone. Social factors can compound or relieve it. Atlit Yam was part of a wider pre-pottery Neolithic world along the Levantine coast and inland valleys. People here were not isolated. They traded stone, ideas, and likely marriage partners with other communities. So when climate and sea level changed, they were not just dealing with salt in their own wells. They were navigating their place in a shifting human landscape. We cannot see their arguments or alliances directly, but we can imagine the possibilities. If fields failed or pastures shrank, disputes over land and water could have sharpened. Groups that once cooperated might have begun to guard resources more tightly. A neighbouring inland village might have refused to share access to its springs. Or, conversely, the people of Atlit Yam might have found new partners and routes, trading more heavily in marine resources in exchange for grain or stone. Trade networks themselves may have been under strain. Rising seas do not only affect one small bay, they redraw entire coasts. Harbours silt up, familiar landing spots vanish. A canoe trip that used to hug a stable shore might become riskier as sandbars shift and storm surges penetrate farther. Disrupted exchange would show up in subtle ways in changing sources of flint, in altered patterns of imported materials. Demography adds another layer. A settlement can feel crowded or empty without leaving obvious archaeological signatures. If younger families began leaving earlier for higher ground, the age structure of the remaining community could skew older. If, instead, Atlit Yam became a refuge for people whose own sites were already lost to the waves, it might have temporarily swollen in size, putting yet more pressure on marginal land and water. We have hints of fluctuation in the density of features across the site. Some areas show signs of rebuilding and reuse, others of abandonment and infilling, but not enough resolution to say whether the last generations saw growth, stability, or decline. What we do see is change. That makes it hard to answer a deceptively simple question. Did Atlit Yam die slowly, or did its people decide more or less together that it was time to go? From the ground traces alone, gradual decline and planned relocation can look remarkably similar. Imagine a scenario of slow retreat. As wells turned brackish, some households might have moved their main activities slightly inland, maintaining a presence in the old village while starting new plots higher up. Houses nearest the shore fall out of use first. Their timbers are salvaged, their stones reused. Burials beneath house floors become less frequent as people invest more in the new place than the old. One day, nobody lights a hearth there anymore, but there is no single moment you can point to and say, this is when it ended. Now imagine a more deliberate shift. Environmental and social pressures accumulate. Storms get worse. Crop yields wobble. Trade becomes unreliable. People gather, perhaps even at that stone circle near the wells, to discuss what comes next. They weigh the costs of staying against the risks of moving. Eventually, they agree to relocate the community, carrying knowledge, tools, and perhaps even some of the stones to a safer site. The old village is not obliterated, it is simply left. In the archaeological record, both stories leave behind empty houses, silting wells and a shoreline that continues to advance long after the last footstep. Without clear signs of catastrophe, distinguishing a village that faded away from one that was consciously abandoned is extremely difficult. And yet, for Atlit Yam, that distinction matters, because it frames how we interpret what happened next. Was the final chapter of this underwater village a drawn-out negotiation with a changing sea, each generation creeping a little farther from the water's edge? Or did a more abrupt shock, a cluster of storms, a sudden change in water quality, a breakdown in wider networks, tip the balance and push people to leave in a relatively short span of time? Those are the two main models archaeologists now weigh: slow retreat versus sudden shock. The physical evidence can support elements of both. In the next sections we will follow each possibility in turn, first the idea of a rapid, perhaps violent event, and then the quieter but no less powerful story of a coastline that drowned by inches. If you're looking for a single terrible day at Atlit Yam, There is one candidate that always comes up: a wave. Not the ordinary kind that rises and falls with the wind, but a wall of water born far offshore. A tsunami. Around the Mediterranean, tsunamis are not rare in deep time. Underwater earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and even the sudden collapse of volcanic flanks have sent pulses racing across the basin more than once. One of the more dramatic scenarios people have proposed for the early Holocene involves the eastern side of Mount Etna, on Sicily, failing catastrophically and sliding into the sea. A collapse like that would have displaced unimaginable volumes of water, sending waves outward in all directions toward North Africa, toward Greece, and toward the Levantine coast, where Atlit Yam once sat. On paper, it's an elegant story. A vulnerable, low-lying village. A rising sea already eating at its margins. Then a single extreme event sweeping in, finishing the job and forcing everyone who survived to leave at once. But stories in archaeology have to meet the evidence. If a tsunami had washed across Atlit Yam while it was still inhabited, it should have left a particular kind of mark in the sediment. Tsunami deposits tend to be distinctive. They're often made of an odd mix of materials that don't normally sit together. Coarse sand where there should be fine silt, pebbles dropped into what used to be quiet mud, shells from deeper water thrown far inland, fragments of land plants tangled with marine debris. In a vertical cut through the ground, you might see a relatively orderly sequence of occupation layers: hearth ash, trampled floors, small domestic pits capped suddenly by a chaotic band. A layer that cuts across older features, fills hollows indiscriminately, and contains things out of place. Pottery sherds, animal bones and house stones jumbled together with offshore shells and foreign sand. Above that, perhaps nothing more from the people who lived there. That is what researchers go looking for when they test the tsunami hypothesis. Not just a sense of disturbance, but a very specific fingerprint, a laterally continuous anomalous deposit that can be traced across the site and ideally beyond it, tied in both composition and age to known offshore landslides or earthquakes. At Atlit Yam, the picture is more complicated. There are indeed layers of reworked material in and around the settlement. Some peripheral zones show coarse sands and gravels intruding into what have been calmer, finer sediments. There are jumbled assemblages of shells and stones, and in some places what look like erosional scours, hollows carved and then infilled by more energetic water. These have been cited as possible tsunami indicators. They do show that at least some high-energy events reached the area. But high-energy water has more than one source. Storm surges during intense Mediterranean winter storms can also bring in coarse sand, move stones, and rearrange shoreline deposits. They can flood low-lying ground, throw up rack lines, and carve channels. In the stratigraphy, storm deposits can mimic tsunami layers at small scales, especially in a coastal plain already being nibbled by waves. Distinguishing between the two requires careful measurements: grain size distributions, the orientation of particles, the presence of microfossils from specific water depths. One of the key differences is often scale and continuity. A major tsunami can blanket tens or hundreds of kilometers of coastline with a similar sedimentary signature at roughly the same time. Storms, even severe ones, tend to leave more patchy, localized traces that vary from bay to bay. At Atlit Yam, we have detailed slices of the seabed right over and around the site. We do not yet have a perfectly matched, regionally traceable tsunami layer of the right age marching along the whole Carmel coast. Some cores and offshore surveys suggest high-energy marine incursions during the broader period of occupation and abandonment. Others look more consistent with ordinary storm reworking and steady sea level rise. Inside the village, the pattern also refuses to resolve into a single, clean catastrophe. The houses are not uniformly smashed and buried under one chaotic blanket. Many structures remain standing to wall height, with floors, installations, and even delicate features intact. Wells show gradual infilling and rising salinity signatures rather than abrupt burial. The burials beneath floors continue into the later phases and do not suddenly cluster in a way that screams disaster victims. This doesn't rule out a wave. It just pushes us toward a more nuanced version. Imagine a community already under pressure from brackish wells, soggy yards, and an eroding shore. Then, sometime in its later life, an unusually powerful marine event sweeps across the coastal plain. Whether it was a true tsunami from a far-off landslide or an extreme storm surge driven by local weather, the effect on daily life could have been severe. Fires doused, stored grain soaked, animal pens torn apart, fields contaminated with salt and sand in a single season. Such an event might not obliterate the entire village or leave a textbook tsunami layer everywhere. It might hit hardest at the edges, toppling a few houses, stripping away soils, filling some pits and working areas with messy, mixed deposits. The core of the settlement could survive physically, but socially, something may have shifted. An already precarious balance could tip. Families who had been tolerating salty water and uneven harvests might interpret the wave as a sign, literal or symbolic, that the place was no longer viable. The cost of rebuilding, of cleaning wells and restoring fields, might have seemed too high compared to simply moving a short distance inland, or joining relatives at another site. In that scenario, the sudden wave doesn't erase Atlit Yam. It accelerates a departure that was already being considered. This is why archaeologists keep the tsunami hypothesis in play, but with caution. It is a plausible mechanism in a tectonically and volcanically active region. It fits with some of the disturbed deposits and with the vulnerability of a low, saturated coastal plain. Yet on its own, at a single site, it is very hard to prove. Without a clear, regionally correlated layer of the right age stretching along the coast, and ideally offshore evidence of the triggering event, Atlit Yam can only offer hints, not a verdict. So, could there have been a sudden wave? Possibly. It might have been a true tsunami born from a distant collapse, or a cluster of extraordinary storms that felt just as devastating to the people standing on that shore. It might have been the shock that turned slow retreat into a more decisive move. But even if there was a great wave, it did not act on a blank slate. It struck a coastline already drowning by inches, a village already negotiating with a restless sea. To see that longer story, we have to step back from the idea of a single day and watch the shoreline itself disappear. To understand what happened to Atlit Yam, we have to slow everything down. Forget the idea of a single terrible morning. Instead, imagine a shoreline changing on a timescale no one person could fully see. Not a crashing disaster, but a creeping one. At the end of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, so much water was locked up in glaciers that global sea level was more than 100 meters lower than it is today. Coastlines all over the planet sat far out from their present positions. What is now the eastern Mediterranean was bordered by wide coastal plains, marshes and gentle slopes, exactly the kind of environments small farming and herding communities would later find attractive. After about 18,000 years ago, those ice sheets began to melt in earnest. Glaciers in North America and Eurasia retreated. Giant ice caps over Scandinavia and Canada thinned and collapsed. All that meltwater flowed into the oceans. Global sea level rose. Not all at once, and not at a single uniform rate. There were pulses when melting sped up, quieter intervals when it slowed. But between roughly 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, the broad window that includes Atlit Yam's life, the overall trend was relentless. Centimetre by centimetre, year after year, the sea climbed. If you compress that into human terms, it feels almost still. In any given decade, the shoreline might only move a few metres inward. Children born in the village would grow up with a sea that felt basically normal. Their grandparents might remember the shore sitting a bit farther out, but memory is fuzzy. A receding field boundary or a flooded low patch might be chalked up to an unusually wet winter, a bad year, or the anger of spirits, not a planet-scale meltwater pulse. That's where another key idea comes in: relative sea level. When we say sea level rose, it sounds like the ocean surface simply went up like water in a bathtub. In reality, the coastline is the meeting point of two moving things, the sea and the land. Relative sea level is what actually matters to people standing on the ground. It's the vertical distance between the water surface and the solid earth beneath your feet. And it can change either because the ocean is rising, or because the land is sinking or lifting, or because sediments are building up or washing away. Around the Carmel coast, all three processes were in play. As global sea level rose, waves pushed farther inland, gnawing at the edges of the coastal plain. At the same time, river systems and small streams were delivering sediments, sand, silt, and mud that could locally build up low ground, creating marshes, bars, and shallow lagoons. Meanwhile, the Earth's crust in this region was still responding, very slowly, to the removal of distant ice sheets and to local tectonics. Parts of the margin could subside by small but significant amounts over thousands of years. From the point of view of the villagers at Atlit Yam, this would have translated into a messy, uneven experience. One part of the shoreline might erode rapidly, another might silt up and become marshy. Shallow depressions might fill with water more easily in winter. Wells that once yielded fresh water might start to taste brackish as the saltwater table crept inland and upward. People do not watch this passively. Atlit Yam shows signs of adaptation. Some structures appear to have had their floors resurfaced or built up over time. Changes in the wells point to intervention. New shafts dug, old ones partially filled. Adjustments made as water quality shifted. Areas that became too waterlogged could be abandoned or repurposed. Paths and working spaces could be relocated to slightly higher, drier spots. Zoom out from the individual hearth or doorway, and a plausible sequence emerges. The original village might have been sited on what felt like safe, dry ground, with good access to fresh water and nearby marine resources. As the relative sea level rose, driven by global meltwater, local subsidence and shifting sediments, the boundary between land and sea crept closer. Yards that had been dry became seasonally wet. Fields that once produced well might have suffered from waterlogging or salt intrusion. Wells, the lifeline of the settlement, gradually recorded the encroachment, increasing salinity, rising water tables, changes in the microfossils preserved in their infill. At some point, the cost-benefit calculation would shift. A community can only raise floors so many times. You can move a pen, shift a path, build a small embankment. You can dig a new well a few tens of meters inland. You can try to drain patches of marshy ground. All of that buys time, measured in generations. But as the trend continues, these fixes accumulate like patches on an old garment. Eventually, someone decides that mending isn't worth it anymore. That moment of decision does not need to coincide with the final disappearance of the place beneath the waves. When we look at Atlit Yam today, it lies roughly 8 to 12 meters below the present sea surface, depending on exactly which part of the site you measure. That depth is not the result of a single catastrophic drop. It's the cumulative outcome of thousands of years of steadily rising global oceans, ongoing sediment dynamics along the coast, and slow vertical motions of the land. It also means something important for how we imagine the end. By the time the last families walked away from Atlit Yam, whenever that final season came, the village was almost certainly still on dry land, or at least on ground that only flooded intermittently. Abandonment could have happened when the sea was still several meters lower than it is now. The wells might have been salty but usable. The houses might have stood damp but repairable. The decision to leave could have been made in a landscape that looked marginal and troublesome, not one literally underwater. Only later, long after the last hearth went cold, would the shoreline continue its quiet inland march. The abandoned houses, no longer maintained, would begin to sag. Erosion would bite at the edge of the settlement. Storms would cut channels, redistribute sand, and lay down new layers over old floors. Season by season, the water table would rise. Standing water would linger longer each winter. Finally, the waves would roll where goats once grazed. By perhaps 1,000 or more years after abandonment, the spot that had once been a living village would be part of the shallow seafloor. Another few millennia of relative sea level rise would carry it down to its present depth, beyond the reach of ordinary human notice, preserved in a kind of accidental time capsule. This is the most conservative reading of the evidence. No single day the sea came in is required. Instead, we have gradual environmental forcing, a long-term rise in global sea level modulated by local land movements and sedimentary changes, steadily pushing a marginal coastal settlement toward the point where leaving made more sense than staying. Any storms or waves that struck along the way could have accelerated the process, but they were working on a coastline already fated to drown, inch by inch. In that sense, Atlit Yam did not sink in a moment. It was outlived by the sea. For all the detail Atlit Yam gives us, there is an equally important category of things it stubbornly withholds. Start with what sounds simple but isn't. How many people lived here? We can count house foundations, plot the space of courtyards and work areas, estimate how many bodies could plausibly fit around a hearth. We can compare to better preserved Neolithic sites on dry land. That gives us ballpark figures. Perhaps a few dozen people at any given time, maybe a small network of families. But it is only a range, not a head count. We don't know how densely those houses were packed at peak occupation, how many structures have been erased by later erosion, or how many short-lived shelters left no trace at all. A village can feel crowded or half empty with the same number of buildings depending on how people actually used them. The archaeology doesn't fix that picture for us. The same problem appears when we try to pin down how long the site was occupied. Radiocarbon dates from bones, seeds and timbers cluster between roughly 9,000 and 8,300 years ago. That's the general window. But does that represent a continuous 700-year run, generation after generation, or several shorter occupations with gaps in between? Were there pauses after storm damage, or periods when only a fraction of the community stayed on while others moved inland? Our samples are too sparse, and the dating uncertainties too wide, to draw a fine-grained timeline. We know Atlit Yam was alive during that slice of the early Holocene. We do not know whether its story was one long, unbroken narrative, or a set of repeated returns to a familiar shore. Even the moment of abandonment refuses to resolve into a precise date. We can say the latest radiocarbon ages suggest activity near the younger end of that 9,000, 8,300 year range. We can model how quickly the sea must have risen to cover the site by the time it reached its present depth. By combining those curves, researchers can outline a plausible few hundred-year window when the last fires were likely lit. But the exact year, or even the exact human generation that finally chose to walk away, is beyond our reach. The archaeological record rarely offers that kind of temporal resolution, and underwater sites almost never do. Part of the reason lies in what water preserves and what it erases. Stone survives beautifully. The standing well linings, the stone circle, the bases of walls, the grinding stones and flint tools, all of these endure. They move a little, they tilt. They get half buried, but they are still there to be mapped, measured and dated. Organic materials are another story. Wood, reeds, basketry, textiles, leather, roof coverings, wooden fences, fish traps, children's toys, almost everything made from plant fibers or animal skins is either gone or preserved in fragmentary form at best. Even bones can be selectively dissolved or scattered by currents and burrowing organisms. This creates a skewed picture. We are seeing the stone skeleton of a village whose softer tissues have mostly vanished. A place that may once have been noisy with woven mats, wooden racks, drying nets, and hanging skins now looks like an arrangement of bare foundations and heavy tools. Any reconstruction has to fill in a lot of blanks. Then there is the basic limit of how much of Atlit Yam we have actually touched. Only a portion of the site has been systematically excavated. Divers work in small grids, carefully clearing sand and sediment from constrained areas. Each season exposes a little more, but large stretches of the buried settlement remain under the seabed, invisible. The mapped outline suggests the site extends beyond the areas we've seen in detail. Sonar hints at further stone features still covered. That means our view is, by definition, partial. The houses we know may not be the whole residential area. The burials we've found may not represent all family lines. There could be specialised zones, more workshops, more storage pits, perhaps even additional ritual structures lying a few metres away under unexcavated sand. This incompleteness matters when we try to explain why the village was finally abandoned. Different scenarios can fit the evidence we do have. A slow increase in salinity in the wells could point to rising relative sea level. It might also reflect changes in local groundwater or reduced maintenance when the community was already losing people for other reasons. A concentration of burials might hint at disease, but it might just as easily be the cumulative result of generations of ordinary deaths in a preferred burial spot. We can imagine a mix of pressures, wells turning brackish, storms taking more of the shoreline each decade, a few bad years of harvest, perhaps a new inland settlement offering better land, or shifts in trade routes making this particular bay less central. Economic decisions, social tensions, conflicts with neighbouring groups, or internal realignments could all have played a role, and most of those would leave only indirect archaeological traces. Good practice requires us to keep these layers separate, the data and the stories we build to connect them. The data are solid where they are solid, the dates from charred seeds, the depth of the site below present sea level, the layout of stone-built features, the animal bones showing a mixed economy of herding, hunting and fishing, the human skeletons with their particular pathologies. Those are the fixed points. Interpretation lives in the space between them. When we talk about stress, adaptation, or decision-making, we are building bridges from one data point to another, using comparisons with other Neolithic sites and our understanding of coastal processes. Some bridges are short and sturdy, others are longer and more speculative. The key is to remember where interpretation begins. The mystery of Atlit Yam is not a blank canvas we can paint anything onto. It is bounded on all sides by evidence, by dates, depths, artifacts and absences. Within that boundary there is room for more than one plausible story, but not for anything at all. We cannot turn it into Atlantis, or a single moment cataclysm, just because that would be more dramatic. Instead, we are left with something subtler. A real village, lived in by real people, now sitting 8 to 12 metres under the Mediterranean, gives us enough to say what must have been true, what could have been true, and what almost certainly wasn't. The rest, the exact number of voices in the night, the exact year someone locked a door for the last time, remains in the quiet space between stones and sea. Atlit Yam forces us to confront a simple, unsettling question. If one early village ended up 8 to 12 metres beneath the waves, how many others did too? During the period when Atlit Yam was occupied, global sea level was still climbing out of the last ice age. Around 20,000 years ago, at the glacial maximum, the oceans stood roughly 120 metres lower than today. By 9,000 years ago, they had risen most of the way. But not all. Shorelines were on the move, quietly, steadily, The boundary between land and sea was sliding inland, sometimes by tens of meters in a single human lifetime, sometimes faster during pulses of meltwater. Atlit Yam sits in that moving margin. It happens to be in a place where the seabed is gentle, the sediment is kind, and modern coastal development gave archaeologists a chance to notice it. That combination is rare, but the processes that created it were not. The early Holocene was full of bays, lagoons, river mouths, and shallow shelves that would have looked like good places to live until the water kept coming. Coastal sites matter because that shifting edge of land and sea has always been attractive. In the early Neolithic, shorelines offered exactly what small farming communities needed: fresh water from coastal springs and shallow wells, fertile soils in river deltas and alluvial fans, and a built-in safety net of marine resources. If crops failed inland, you could fish. If herds had a bad year, you could harvest shellfish and seaweed, trap birds in wetlands, collect driftwood. Salt could be gathered or produced in ponds. Seals, waterfowl, and migratory fish added seasonal abundance. These edges also became corridors for movement and exchange. As soon as people were experimenting with boats, simple dugouts, skin-covered frames, or bundled reed craft, coasts turned into highways. Short hops along the shoreline connected one bay to the next. A community like Atlit Yam could, in principle, have been part of a much longer chain. Small villages and camps strung out along the eastern Mediterranean, sharing obsidian, shells, ideas about house plans, perhaps even marriage partners. Many of the earliest experiments in farming and herding seem to cluster near such edges. In the Levant, along the Aegean, around the Black Sea, in parts of Southeast Asia, in the shallow shelf regions of what is now the North Sea and the Sunda Shelf, early Holocene people were taking the first uncertain steps toward more settled life. Some of those steps happened on land that is still dry. Others almost certainly happened on land that is now drowned. Atlit Yam is visible to us because we got lucky with the preservation conditions and the tools we now have to look. The technology for finding sites like this has advanced dramatically over the last few decades. Instead of sending divers to grope around in the dark, archaeologists can start by scanning the seabed from the surface. Multi-beam sonar sends out sound waves and measures the echoes to build a detailed map of the seafloor. Sharp rises, circular depressions, straight lines that don't look geological, these can all hint at buried walls, wells, or stone alignments. Side-scan sonar creates image-like tapestries of the bottom, where patterns of roughness and reflectivity can pick out concentrations of stone or unusual features. Sub-bottom profilers go a step further. They send low-frequency sound pulses into the sediment and record reflections from different layers below. In the right conditions, this can reveal buried channels, peat layers from ancient marshes, and sometimes even the ghostly outlines of former shorelines and human-built structures. A flat surface abruptly cut by a vertical anomaly might be the buried face of an old cliff. A lens of organic, rich sediment can mark an ancient lake or wetland where people once camped. Sediment coring adds ground truth. Researchers drive hollow tubes down into the seabed and pull up columns of layered mud and sand. By analysing pollen, microfossils, grain size, and bits of charcoal or bone, they can reconstruct past environments, when an area was dry land, when it turned to marsh, when the sea finally swept in. Radiocarbon dating of those layers pins the story to actual calendar years. Once an area looks promising, remotely operated vehicles or OVs can be sent down to take a closer look. These tethered robots carry cameras, lights, sometimes small sampling tools. They can hover a meter above the bottom, trace the line of a stone wall, zoom in on a worked flint lying half buried in silt, or place markers for divers to investigate later. In deeper water where divers cannot safely work, ROVs may be the only eyes we ever get on sites like this. And yet, even with all this equipment, the search is slow. Continental shelves are vast. Funding and ship time are limited. Most of the world's submerged prehistory has never been systematically surveyed. Before we go further, a brief pause. If you enjoy drifting through this kind of deep time mystery at a gentler pace, there's a book that expands on stories like this one. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's a discount running this week. It's written with the same calm, evidence-based approach we're using here, just in a form you can fall asleep to. Back under the water, there are also less technical, more human constraints. Underwater excavation is time-consuming and exhausting. Divers have limited bottom time each day. They work in low visibility, often in cold water and currents. Every artifact must be documented in place, photographed, measured, and then carefully lifted, often still encased in sediment. Conservation begins immediately once items reach the surface, because exposure to air can trigger rapid deterioration. Then there are ethical and practical pressures that have nothing to do with archaeology. Coastal construction projects, offshore pipelines, wind farms, and sand extraction can damage submerged sites before anyone knows they exist. In some regions, unauthorized divers and looters strip artifacts from wrecks and ancient settlements, removing them from their context and selling them on the private market. Laws try to keep up, but enforcement varies widely. Even where protections exist, there are decisions to be made. Do you fully excavate a site now, with the techniques available today, or leave large portions buried for future researchers with better tools? How do you balance the scientific value of disturbing a well-preserved underwater landscape against the knowledge that sediment, for now, is also its best protection? Because of all this, Atlit Yam stands out as a rare, detailed snapshot. It is not unique in principle. Other submerged Neolithic sites have been found off Israel, off the coasts of Italy, Croatia, Denmark, and elsewhere. But few offer the same combination of preserved architecture, wells, burials, and clear environmental context at such a manageable depth. It gives us a three-dimensional freeze frame of a vanished shoreline world that we usually see only in fragments. Rather than treating Atlit Yam as an isolated curiosity, it may be more accurate to see it as one well-lit room in a mostly darkened house. We know from sea level curves and ancient shorelines, traced on sonar maps, that entire belts of early coastal settlement must now lie offshore. Some will be simple camps, ephemeral traces nearly impossible to detect. Some will be more like Atlit Yam, small but complex communities with houses, wells, animal pens, maybe shrines, now resting under meters of water and sand. How many? We do not know. What we can say is that the processes that drowned Atlit Yam were global, and that people everywhere had similar reasons to live near the sea. For now, this village is one of the clearest windows we have into that lost coastal world. Through its stones and bones and waterlogged wells, we glimpse a pattern that probably repeated hundreds, perhaps thousands of times around ancient shorelines. A pattern of attraction, adaptation, and eventual retreat in the face of a sea that did not stop rising. So what, in the end, happened to this one village? When archaeologists try to answer that, they don't start with drama. They start with water. During the centuries Atlit Yam was occupied, sea level in the eastern Mediterranean was still rising. Not in a smooth, steady line, but in fits and starts, driven by the last major pulses of meltwater from shrinking ice sheets. Regional reconstructions suggest that between roughly 7,000 and 6,000 BCE, the shoreline here crept inland by tens to a few hundred meters per human lifetime. That long, slow encroachment is written directly into the site. The village now lies 8 to 12 meters below the modern surface, and sediment cores around it show a transition from terrestrial soils and freshwater deposits to brackish, then fully marine sediments. Microfossils in those cores, pollen grains, foraminifera, tiny shell fragments, shift from land plants and freshwater species to organisms that can only live in the sea. Radiocarbon dates from those layers bracket the end of occupation. The land Atlit Yam stood on did not simply sink. The water rose over it. But sea level alone isn't the whole story. The people at Atlit Yam seem to have been paying very close attention to water long before the first wave touched their houses. Those wells we talked about earlier are the key. They tap the coastal aquifer, the lens of fresh groundwater that floats on denser seawater beneath the land. As global sea level climbed, that lens was squeezed and pushed inland. Salt water gradually intruded. At Atlit Yam, the lowest wells show clear signs of having gone out of use while the village was still occupied. The inhabitants backfilled them with broken tools, animal bones and debris. The upper parts of those same wells now contain marine shells and organisms, showing that after people stopped drawing water from them, the sea eventually flooded in. This suggests a two-stage stress. First, the fresh water became unreliable. Only later did the sea physically reclaim the ground. Add to that the ordinary hazards of a Holocene coastline. The eastern Mediterranean is seismically active. Submarine landslides, offshore quakes, and occasional tsunamis have left their marks in nearby cores and coastal deposits from later periods. At Atlit Yam itself, some researchers have pointed to collapsed walls and disarticulated stones as possible evidence for a sudden jolt, a tremor or wave that damaged structures near the end of the village's life. Others are more cautious. Stones fall in many ways. Underwater, storms and currents can rearrange debris. For now, there is no clear, unambiguous tsunami layer slicing cleanly across the site. No sheet of distinctive, high-energy sand and rubble that everyone agrees marks a single catastrophic event. So we're left weighing two broad models. One is gradual relocation. In this version, families notice the wells becoming brackish, fields waterlogged, winter storms biting closer each year. Roofs need more repair. Salt creeps into soils. Young adults start moving upslope to drier ground, perhaps to a sister settlement we haven't yet found. House by house, the old village thins out. Eventually, only abandoned walls and empty hearths remain as the tide line creeps over. The other model keeps that slow pressure in the background, but adds a sharper ending. Here, Atlit Yam lives under stress for generations, adapting as best it can, until one bad year, or one bad day, tips the balance. A storm surge floods the lowest houses. A small tsunami tears at the shoreline. An earthquake cracks wells or collapses walls. Not everyone dies, but enough is damaged that rebuilding in the same spot stops making sense. The place is left behind, its remaining structures soon buried in sand, then sea. When we put all the evidence together, the most reasonable answer may be that there wasn't a single cause at all. Instead of looking for one big disaster, it may be more accurate to picture a sequence. Decades of rising groundwater and encroaching tides, intermittent storms and floods, perhaps an earthquake or coastal slump somewhere along the line, each event nudging decisions. Stay one more season, repair one more wall, then finally choose not to. That's the human core of Atlit Yam's ending. People here had invested deeply in this strip of coast. They dug wells by hand, built houses, buried their dead beneath the floors, set up standing stones around a freshwater spring. They fished these waters, grazed herds on these soils, watched the same horizon for years. When the sea and the groundwater began to change, they would not have walked away lightly. Someone had to decide when enough was enough. Did families argue about whether to leave? Did some hold on longer than others, patching roofs above walls already lapped by salt spray? Did they visit the graves one last time before moving inland? We don't know. What we see is the result. A village quietly abandoned, then sealed by the very water that had once drawn people there. And there are still sharp questions hanging in the tide line. We don't yet have a clear continuous sequence of shoreline deposits tying the last occupation layer inside the village to the first unmistakable marine layers on top. We lack a second, contemporaneous site upslope that would show where, exactly, the people of Atlit Yam went. We don't have preserved wood or basketry that might carry microscopic traces of that final flood, or a buried layer of storm debris that everyone can agree marks a single terminal event. Until those pieces appear, if they ever do, Atlit Yam remains a story told in outlines. But even in that uncertainty, there is something quietly powerful. The sea, by drowning the village, kept a record that dry land usually erases. It preserved wells, burials, animal bones, and the subtle traces of a community under pressure. Through that preservation, we see not only how people lived in one small place 9,000 years ago, but how they weighed adaptation against attachment, and how in the end they chose to move when the water would not. From here, as the waves roll over the ruins, the story begins to widen again, away from this single village and out into the open sea of everything the water has hidden, and in its own way, kept safe. If you could stand on the seabed at Atlit Yam today and listen, there would be almost nothing to hear. Just the distant murmur of waves, the quiet scrape of sand moving grain by grain, the slow ticking of time. But in that silence, the village is still saying something. Those houses and courtyards outline a way of living that feels both foreign and familiar. People woke to tend fires, ground grain, mended nets, checked on animals. They walked the same paths between doorways, stepped over the same thresholds where we now see nothing but tumbled stone. The pattern of rooms and open spaces shows a community organised around shared work and shared watching, a cluster of lives oriented toward the shore. The wells capture a different layer of their story, cut down into the earth, lined with stones set by hand. They are frozen negotiations with the water table. Early on, they delivered clear, reliable fresh water. Later they faltered, went brackish, and were slowly given up, turned into refuse pits, then finally overtaken by the sea. Each fill layer inside them records choices. What got thrown away, what was no longer worth repairing, when people accepted that a particular source had failed. Beneath the floors, the burials add a quieter voice still. Bodies placed carefully under living spaces suggest ties that did not end at death. The dead remained literally underfoot, part of the architecture of memory. When the last families left, some of those graves stayed sealed and undisturbed until divers opened them again thousands of years later. There is no sign of panic disturbance, no evidence that people dug frantically to rescue their ancestors. The leaving, as far as we can tell, was measured. And then there is that circle of stones around a vanished spring, the ritual feature, if that is what it was. Whether it framed offerings, gatherings, or simply marked a precious source of water, it anchors the site in meaning as well as utility. It hints that people here did not see their landscape as just a set of resources, but as something they entered into relationship with. When the spring changed and the sea advanced, that relationship had to be renegotiated or let go. Put together, the daily routines, the wells, the underfloor burials, the standing stones, and the slow layered submergence tell a single quiet truth. Shorelines are not lines at all. They are zones that move, testing how long human plans can hold their shape against rising water. Atlit Yam, preserved under 8 to 12 metres of sea, becomes a message carried forward from one of those moving edges. It reminds us that coastal communities have always had to balance attachment with awareness, tradition with change, and that sometimes the wisest decision is to leave before the last wall falls. If you found this journey into a drowned village calming or thought-provoking, you can gently tap like, or subscribe if you'd like more slow explorations of the very deep past. I'd love to hear from you in the comments, especially where you're listening from, and whether there's a buried place, underwater or on land, that you think about when you imagine lost histories. And if this kind of evidence-first mystery helps you drift off at night, you might enjoy a longer dive into prehistoric secrets. I've collected some of the most intriguing stories from before writing into a book, written in the same quiet, curious tone as this episode. You can read more about it and pick up a copy if you like at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, imagine the lights of the modern coast far above, the surface blurred by distance, and below it all, the outlines of a village that once stood in the sun. The people are gone, the arguments and laughter long finished, but their wells still hold water, salty now and filled with time, and their stones still wait in the dark, where fish swim through the rooms and the open sea keeps its watch.